Cool, we're live. All right, so welcome to the workshop on case prep. We're going to be looking at the motion This House Will Ban Zoos. It's a classic motion. It's quite, I wouldn't say popular, but it does pop up every now and then. But I think that the general principles behind this motion can be applied to just about every other motion that you eventually come across, especially policy debates that you will be facing quite a few of them at SSIDC. All right, so how do you prep a case? Things that you should not do when you get a motion. Don't jump straight into outcomes. I know that, especially at the school levels, there's this very big temptation to see the motion and immediately start saying, we should argue this, we should argue that. I think we can go, I think we can do this, I think we can do that. It's good for brainstorming and all, but what I suggest is that when you prep a case or when you get a motion, it is more effective to spend some time determining the direction of the case, what you need to prove. So once you identify those things, then you can guide the ideas that you eventually generate. If not, help you identify the sort of correct direction or the better direction, the best direction to take a case. And generally, once you have those things in mind, it generally helps your case improve and creates a better debate overall. So don't jump straight into outcomes, start throwing out random ideas. Do identify the context and the problem in the debate, identify the comparative, identify your burden of proof, and then generate arguments that forward your burden. And after that, work out any mechanisms or counter mechanisms, if needed, to help your case move forward. So how do we do that? Motion decomposition. The easiest way to understand the direction that a debate should go is to break down the wording of the motion. So ask yourself, what exactly does the words in the motion mean? Use WH questions to analyze. I hope you all know what the WH questions are. Who, what, when, why, how. So just pull out, if you don't know where to start, just start asking random questions like what, in this case, this House will ban zoos. I think the most obvious question is what are zoos? And the first answer to that is there. It's a place where animals are held captive. People pay entrance fees to see animals for entertainment. It's a place where endangered animals are preserved and protected. Ask yourself, what does ban mean? It means that the state removes it in its entirety, implies it is harmful and should be restricted. Once you do that, then the analysis can just continue. Ask yourself, why should we ban zoos? What exactly is it about zoos that's so problematic? If it's a place where animals are kept captive, how are they kept captive? In what conditions are they kept? Who are the people that go to zoos to visit or to see those animals? Who pays for the zoos? Is it solely by entrance fees? So these are all questions that you can get, questions you can ask rather, to help you identify the context of the motion, but also to provide characterization about the things that is being discussed essentially, to make the argument more compelling, but also a lot easier to understand, which is, I think, the bigger priority at this level. So, going on, it's a place where animals are kept captive. Here are some more questions to ask. Why should we ban zoos? What are zoos? What uniquely characterizes them? Who runs the zoos? What kind of animals are kept in the zoos? How are animals in zoos treated? These are just questions to start. Once you answer those questions, you will naturally generate more questions. And when those questions are generated, you will just continue asking them and keep asking questions until you are able to see the problem in the debate that needs to be solved by the policy and know the direction that your case needs to go. So questions. What are zoos? Places where animals are kept in captivity, used for entertainment. Are there other places where animals are kept in captivity, like places like wildlife reserves, science laboratories? Will government ban those things as well? I think answer is no, it's not required by the motion. Of course, in Gov, you can choose to do so, but it is an additional burden on Gov. Right. So after you do the motion decomposition, the next thing then to do is to identify the comparative. So in a debate where you have government fighting for the motion and you have opposition fighting against the motion, it often comes down to a comparison between two worlds. So what is the world that government supports? I think quite trivially, banning zoos just means there is no more zoos in society, and the world that op supports is a world where zoos exist. So the comparative is quite obvious. It's between a world with zoos and a world without zoos. It implies the government has a burden to ban zoos in its entirety, and op must oppose the ban in its entirety, so zoos still exist in opposition, right? And I think that identifying the comparative can be very, very important, because if you don't know what the comparison is under your side of the house, or what the exclusive material on your side is, then if you argue things that aren't exclusive, then it's easy for the other side to co-opt those things, or to sort of make a strategic concession towards those things, because it's not required by them to defend it. It's not their burden to defend those things. But also, it helps you to identify things that you don't need to defend in your side of the house. So if your burden is only to ban zoos, then the question that we asked a little bit earlier about whether government also needs to ban things like wildlife sanctuaries, I think the answer to that is no, because the only burden on Gov in this particular debate is to ban zoos specifically. So if opposition asks you questions like, oh, there are a lot of problems with sanctuaries as well, are you also going to ban them? Then the answer from Gov is just no. We don't have a burden to ban those things. Like sanctuaries were going to exist under either side of the house. So that's not the contention in the round. All right. So before we go on to the problem identification, does anyone have a question about comparatives? It's very, very important to identify comparatives. If not, then we can move on. Yeah.
How about comparative between principles? How do you compare principles, and how do you determine which principles are more important in the debate?
So principle comparisons are a bit different than the comparative that I was talking about just now, because you first need to identify the comparative world that you are debating in before you can then identify the principles that exist in those worlds, right? So later on, we're going to look at the principle that Gov needs to defend and the principle that Op needs to defend in this motion. But when it comes down to comparing principles, it often comes down to either A, which principle is more true or more important that needs to be prioritized, or two, which side of the house, or like there's a common principle that both sides agree on, which side of the house best fulfills that principle through the mechanism that's being discussed in the round. So I think that's slightly different from the comparative world that I'm talking about. I hope that's clear. So the next thing after you identify the comparative world is to identify the problem. Just a bit of a caveat here. I personally find it easier to do the problem identification after doing the comparative identification. Some people find it easier to do the converse, so you can see the problem that the motion is trying to solve or overcome, and then identify the comparative from there. Doesn't really matter how you do it as long as you eventually do both. But I just prefer to do it this way. So once you identify the comparative, you need to then look at the problem. So what is the problem with zoos? So after all the questions on the context and characterization, I think that generally speaking, the problem with zoos are that animals are kept in captivity and that animals are used for entertainment. You then need to ask, why is that a problem? And the answer to this question, or specifically, why is this problem something that's bad enough that we need to do something about it? So the first thing here is that using animals as entertainment is one that's morally wrong. So this is eventually the principle that Gov is going to defend in this world. After you identify the comparative world, then it's easier to see which principle applies in this case. But second, because the treatment of animals in zoos is quite abusive. Why is this true? Because in zoos, the animals are used to entertain people. Sometimes animals need to perform on command. Why do they need to perform? Because zoos want to attract people to come see the animals. If there's no performances, then it's just quite boring. You just go to the zoo and see animals sleeping in the cages. I don't think that's very interesting or very attractive. So obviously zoos that want you to come to the zoos to visit them and collect money from entrance fees and stuff like that will want to make the visits more exciting. And part of those things means that you will need to force animals to do interesting things. So once you identify the problem, you then realize that the emotion is a solution to that problem. But you need to explain the process as to how you solve that problem in order for you to claim that you actually solved the problem, right? So how does Gov solve the problem? So banning zoos just means animals are no longer abused and treated badly. How do you ban zoos? So obviously, Gov needs to ban zoos in its entirety. There's a tendency, especially at lower levels, to sort of prop a very soft stance. So like ban just means reduce the number of zoos going around. Like you can't do that. So in order for you to have a good debate, it is always in your interest to defend things in its entirety. So you take a more hardline stance in this regard in order for you to show a clearer benefit and to show a clearer trade-off in the round. So don't be afraid to take harsh trade-offs. If it means that you incur some kinds of problems as a result of the policy, you can always use your mechanism in Gov to mitigate those things or reduce the impact of those problems in order for you to have benefits, but then sort of reduce the scale of the problems that happens as a regard. So after you tell the zoos to close, I think the most obvious question is, where are all these animals going to go? So like, I don't think as government you want to propose selling the animals to meat factories and then like turning them into burgers. Probably not very strategic to do that. So probably the mechanism that you want to support in Gov is things like sending the animals either to wildlife centers or back to the wild. Obviously, animals can't always adapt immediately. So you can have processes like slowly transitioning animals out or just sending them towards wildlife centers where animals are also protected from predators. And later on, we're going to discuss hunters and poachers as well. Because it's important to protect the animals while still preventing or protecting them from abuse. How is it going to affect the ecosystem? I'm sure you all have all studied food chains and food webs at some point. So I think that sending all the animals out into the wild immediately is probably not something you want to support on government, because then UP can run away with a lot of responses like, there's no natural predators in that place, like rabbits in Australia, and then it's going to upset the entire ecosystem in that environment. So probably you're not sending all animals out to the wild to control the environment. All of this is basically the mechanism or the process that you want to, the process of banning zoos that you probably want to discuss in government. So at least you are aware, or you will sort of can deal with the obvious challenges to the model that opposition comes up with. Okay, next is the stance. How hardline do you want to go on government and sometimes on op? So first thing is an understanding of principles. So generally speaking, for debaters, especially the newer ones, we usually support a model of first principles. So sort of identify what is the principle that you are defending on your side of the house, what is the principle that the opposition is going to defend, and just sort of explaining why your principle is true. Because if you identify what the principle is on your side of the house, then it's easier for you to identify specific examples and whether or not you want to support those things or other things. And especially if you're facing teams that don't have a clear grasp on principles, the easiest way to trip them up is to offer them a POI and just ask them some example that forces them or gets them to contradict their principle. And if they do it in their speech, you can call it out later in your speech, and in some cases can even be debate winning. So in this debate, I offer 3 principles here. The first, we should not keep animals captive. The second, we should not use animals for entertainment. And the third, that we should not profit off animals. What do you think the principal stance that Gov should take in this debate?
We should not profit off of animals. Maybe that one.
Okay. Why?
Benefit most for abusing animals. The other two, entertainment, keeping them captive. The money is a big issue to any and letting and being complicit in the treatment of.
Sorry, you're breaking up a little bit. Could you repeat the last part of that?
Basically, I'm saying that in terms of the benefits human derived from animal abuse when it comes to zoo, the one that will have the most benefit would be humans profiting of it and earning money because of animal abuse.
Okay. So in that regard, if you think that the principle you want to defend is not profiting off animals, would you be okay if zoos operate at no profit? So they don't earn money?
Then then there comes the second question: whether or not these animals are treated ethically in the first place. If they're treated ethically, then I won't mind the preservation of zoos. But if they're not, then there's another question in its entirety, lah.
Interesting. So this implies that there is a prioritization of principles in this debate. I think just to make life easy, I don't want to go into secondary principles for this workshop. I think in this regard that it is just easier to just choose one principle, but sort of discussing what that principle implies and what you have to support if you defend this principle and what you have to support if you don't defend this principle is probably important when it comes to case prep. So I just want to move to the next part. Before that, does anyone else want to select a different principle?
I think I would go with the second principle. We should not use animals for entertainment because the entire reason why they're banning zoos in the first place is not because they're profiting off them, it's because the way they're treating the animals. So zoos exist in the first place is because they are supposed to educate the public, since that original purpose isn't being fulfilled. So I think the second principle is the most important one.
Okay, so if you say we should not use animals for entertainment, are you then okay with keeping animals in captivity as long as no one else can see them? So they're not used for entertainment, basically.
I think it all revolves back to how they're treated.
Okay, interesting. That's quite true. The reality is that the principle that Gov defends is probably some combination of all three principles here. And what Emily says is correct. It does come down to the ways that animals are treated. So when you talk about principles, there are things that you probably want to discuss. And in this debate on banning zoos, it's possible for Gov to take any of the three principal stances in this round. So it's up to you which you want to take, which principal stance you want to take. But each choosing the principle that you want to defend is going to impact the mechanisms or the models that you support, but also the kind of examples that you have. So you got to choose strategically. So the first principle that says we should not keep animals captive implies the government does not support any form of animal captivity. So you then need to ask the question of where else are animals kept in captivity? In places like wildlife conservatories, like keeping pets, for instance. These are examples of animals being kept in captivity. So if you want to defend these principles, you must also support on government banning of all kinds of pets and banning of all kinds of wildlife conservatories. So that probably requires you to take a bit of a higher burden, and that's why I would not recommend doing this in this debate. The second principle of not profiting off animals implies that government does not support any kind of profiting off animals in principle. So then the question I asked earlier is that if you have zoos but you don't profit off it, is it then okay? Like if the zoos make things free and like the state pays for those things, like is it then okay? And you will need to answer questions like that because in that circumstance, the reasons as to why you want to ban zoos specifically instead of reforming it or subsidizing those zoos to make it free then comes into question, and you probably need a stronger principle to defend those things. Also, there are other instances in society that we do profit off animals, things like selling meat, for example, selling of pets even, that if opposition questions you on this principle, you probably will have a bit of a hard time defending it. Which then leads to the last principle, right? We should not use animals for entertainment. It implies that Gov does not support any form of entertainment of animals. Does this then mean that Gov is also principally supporting the banning of circuses and the banning of animal documentaries? And I think that when it comes down to it, I'm just gonna spoiler alert, this is probably the easiest principle to defend. We'll look at it in a moment why that's the case. But once you decide the principle line that you're going to take, you just need to defend it all the way. So just go up and say, if opposition asks you, are you principally supporting the banning of circuses, then the answer is just simply, yes, we support the principle of all forms of animal entertainment being banned. With regards to animal documentaries, I would just argue that, it's not really entertainment, it's supposed to be educational. But more importantly, as Emily identified, it's about the ways that animals are treated, and the creation of animal documentaries often does not come at the cost of harming those animals, which is why it's not that big of a problem in Gulf. So each principle stance requires Gulf to defend similar things that are consistent with their principles. So the easiest way to go about things is to identify the lowest burden. This does not mean take a soft stance. It just means don't take on additional burdens aside from the burden that is imposed on you by the motion. So this means that if your burden is to ban zoos, there's no need to take additional burden off. We also ban meat industry. We also ban wildlife conservatory. We also ban owning of pets. Like, these are things that will require you to justify a lot of negative outcomes as a result of those policies. And it's just not something you want to deal with on government. The second is to identify the intuitive and the easiest burden to defend. So again, as I mentioned earlier, you don't necessarily need to defend the principle of not using animals for entertainment. You can take any of the other two, but you need to identify which is the easiest and the most intuitive principle for the judge to buy into, because the judge is also human, and the judge is usually going to buy into the more intuitive case, given that both sides are trying to convince the judge, to support their side of the house. So it doesn't make sense for you to support a counterintuitive or a very advanced philosophical principle that the judge may not be able to understand or buy into. Okay, so banning of zoos, the easiest burden to defend is not using animals for entertainment. It happens exclusively in zoos. I mean, not just zoos, but mainly in zoos. And it's also intuitive because it relies on the fundamental premise that we should not abuse animals. Cool. So once you identify the principle, whichever principle it is, you then need to develop the principle and explain why your side of the house best fulfills that principle obligation by explaining why the outcomes that you eventually reach fall in line with that principle. So why should governments not allow the exploitation of animals for the purposes of entertainment? Note, before you go into the explanation of the mechanisms and the outcomes and all that stuff, you first need to explain why the status quo, or the world as it exists right now, is problematic and why harms accrue as a result. So how are animals exploited in zoos? So you can look at things like animals being kept in cages, being forced to be put on display for visitors. A lot of animals don't like bright light, but because animals like to live in the dark, and like if you go to the zoo and you just see like a bunch of animals hiding under the leaf or in the grass, they're just not very interesting. So often the zoos, what they do is that they force animals out into the light. They're often exposed to light for 12 to 14 hours a day. It's probably not very good for those animals, but that's what happens at zoos. Also, things like animal feedings. Most animals don't like to eat in the presence of other people. So in order for people to be able to watch the feeding of crocodiles or the feeding of tigers, it often requires some degree of starving animals beforehand, so that even if there's a large crowd, and even if the crowd's making a lot of noise, the animals are just so hungry that they will just go out and eat the food anyways. And that's when people get very excited and take pictures and go on Instagram and all that stuff. But the point here is that the starving of animals is a mistreatment of them. The third thing is things like animal performances. Training animals require the use of punishment, beating, whipping to deny of food, etc., to get them to perform on command. So if you've ever been to an animal safari, then they want to get the animal to come out at a certain time so that visitors can see the animals. If not, they just get very disappointed. They don't want to come back and pay money again. So you need to train the animals, and the process of training the animals can, in many instances, be quite abusive. Like, I think easy parallels to draw are things like circuses, how you get animals to perform on command. You need to whip them, you need to starve them in order to get them to do so. So after you explain why harms accrue, then identify the reasons behind it and why structurally those harms are likely to manifest. Did someone ask a question? No, let's move on. Okay, so just saying that zoos are harmful is often not enough for you to win on Gulf, because opposition can come up with a number of ways to reduce the harms that they exist. And if they're able to reduce the harm and they're able to show some value to zoos, you're probably going to lose. So what you need to demonstrate from Gov right from the start is why those harms are structurally likely to occur by looking at the structural reasoning behind like the likelihood of those harms coming into existence, basically. So in this case, you can talk about zoos being profit motivated. They need funds to pay for the maintenance of infrastructure, to pay zookeepers, keeping cages clean, getting food for animals, medical supplies, etc. Like, sure, some zoos are public, but they're usually not fully state funded. So in order for them to gain profit, they need to get visitors. In order for them to get visitors, they need to make those visits exciting, which is the second part, right? Purpose is to expose visitors to animals. Therefore, they need to make visits exciting. They need to put on performances. They need to keep exotic animals, etc., just to make the visits exciting. Finally, then, you need to explain why the exploitation of animals is bad. So this is where you sort of ground the principle of why exploiting animals for entertainment is something harmful. So firstly, sort of explain why animals are living creatures that can feel pain. They're sentient. They're aware of their surroundings. This means that subjecting animals to abuse is likely to inflict pain on those living creatures, and that's not something that we ought to support. As humans, even if we are biologically superior to animals, by virtue of having rationality and morality, we ought not support abuse in principle. Lastly, then you can just say that animals deserve protection from abuse because it is infliction of pain on them and the reduction of their qualities of life. So just flat out saying that animals have rights as well, they deserve certain kinds of protection, just means that we ought not violate those rights. But even if, like, I think animal rights is quite controversial, what you can always argue on Gov is that even if animals don't have rights, humans should not support abuse in principle, which is why we should not inflict abuse upon animals in this regard. It's something considered immoral. And that's why we need to ban zoos. Where has this been done before? If you have example to help ground the principle, make the case more intuitive. Note that we've already banned a lot of different kinds of animals abuse at home. So pet owners can be fined for not feeding pets. In like they beat their pets up if they drown them, like if the dog has puppies because they didn't neuter the dog, and then like they don't want to take care of the puppies, so they just drown the puppies in the drain, then they can be fined for that, and the animals can be taken away from them. Also things like animal slaughter. So you need to shock the animal first so that they're unconscious before the killing blow strikes, so that the animal is not traumatized, because when you bring the animal to the slaughterhouse, they know they're going to die, and that knowledge itself is one that can be quite torturing for animals. Also, slaughterhouses must be kept far away from animal quarters. Like, these are all things that exist right now in the status quo that show that the governments already take a stance against the exploitation of animals and the infliction of harm against them. So the conclusion to this is that zoos are inherently exploitative of animals, hence we must ban them. So through the mechanisms that you identified earlier on how you remove animals and just transition them towards, like, I guess, wildlife sanctuaries of some kind, you sort of reduce the exploitation and reduce the abuse of animals, because zoos no longer exist, and the profit incentive and the incentive to get people to come and watch those animals no longer exists. All right, so this basically what I think is one of the arguments you can run on Gov. There's obviously a lot of other things you can argue. But for general case direction, I hope this helps to identify the direction that you should go as a team. So is there any questions about the Gov case before we move on to the op? Nope. All right, opposition it is. So earlier on, we identified the comparative. It's a world with zoos versus a world without zoos. So op needs to defend a world with zoos, right? And opposition cannot tweak zoos to say, aha, we'll have zoos, but we won't have visitors, because by definition, there is no longer a zoo. There is like a normal animal conservatory. If that happens, then as the DPM, you just need to directly call them out. Opposition is not defending their burden. Their burden requires them to defend zoos as they exist in the status quo, or like whatever mechanism that exists to fix the problems. So like the conclusion is just, the point is that op must defend a world with zoos, and hence must identify reasons why zoos bring value to society. So what's the burden of proof in opposition? What does op need to defend? In most cases, when it comes to policy debates, op just needs to defend the status quo. So I think there are some questions that you probably should ask as the opposition in prep, because I think when you do the characterization and contextualization of zoos, the most obvious question is, are zoos treating animals badly right now? And if they are, what can you do about it in opposition without banning zoos? So, which is the second question, right? Can status quo be improved? If abuse really is a problem, are there alternative ways to reduce it? Do we do so in the status quo now already? Note, important thing to note here, that any counter mechanisms that you want to support in opposition needs to be mutually exclusive to the Gulf model. If not, Gulf can just co-opt them and say, I want to achieve a similar outcome. So it's like, if opposition says, our counter model is, I don't know, donating a large sum of money towards animal charities, then that's not something that is exclusive to zoos. And Gulf can also say that we're happy to donate money to animal charities as well. We just don't think zoos should exist. And then that benefit becomes symmetric and no longer becomes a contention in the round, i.e. it's not a reason for opt to win a debate. Also note that in all policy debates, there is no burden on opposition to solve the problem identified by Gulf. The only burden on op is to show that this policy makes things worse. That's all. So even if the status quo isn't perfect, it is still a preferable world as opposed to a world with this policy, just because things get so much worse when you try to ban zoos. So if you ever meet a team, if you are op and you say that these are a number of harms that result from this policy, and if the DPM or the Gulf comes up and says that opposition doesn't provide a solution to the problem, just remember that you don't have to provide a solution to the problem. Your only burden is to explain why the policy leads to worse outcomes. That's all. I hope that's clear. That has tripped up many a team at ITC. Hopefully it doesn't trip you up. Okay, so same thing. What is the principal stance that opposition should take in this debate? Number one, zoos are the best means to protect endangered species. Second, animals are inferior beings to humans. We can use them however we please. And thirdly, zoos provide entertainment for children. The state is obligated to protect it. Anyone? I'm going to call the quieter people.
Principle one.
Okay. Principle one, zoos are the best means to protect endangered species. Why?
I think because there's the idea of human supervision behind it. So in that sense, it kind of guarantees that these animals are in some way kind of protected. And if you increase, government oversight over zoos, it also reduces the incentive for zoo owners to abuse their animals.
Interesting. Anyone else have a different idea? Brian Kwok.
Can I go for like principle two?
Number two, animals are inferior beings to humans. Okay, why do you say that?
Yeah, because if we really want to protect animals, like we should also ban the bee farms or all the livestock. Like we are abusing them, like the chicken farm. We are just leaving the female chicken behind and just directly kill the male chicken. So if we really want to protect animals, like banning zoo is not enough.
Okay, that's very, very interesting. So basically what you are attempting to show is that the Gulf principle of reducing exploitation of animals is not one that's exclusive to zoos, which therefore means that Gulf concedes to some extent that the protection of animals is not the most important priority in this debate. Okay, cool. Anyone else have a different idea? Would anyone like to defend the third principle? Entertaining children is very important. If not, children cannot see animals, then they're very sad. Okay, never mind, let's move on. Okay, so the first, so again, you probably can support some combination of these principles. Again, please identify the lowest burden. You don't need to take on higher burden than what's required for you to explain why zoos should continue to exist. So the first question, why zoos are the best means to protect endangered species? You need to ask, why is protecting endangered animals a good thing? And why is it something that we should support or prioritize in this round? What are alternative ways to protect animals in government, and how do zoos compare against them? So if you want to defend the first principle, then you need to explain why zoos are the best mechanism to protect endangered species. Because if government is able to identify other ways that they can protect endangered species, then they basically are able to reach a similar conclusion or a similar benefit to opposition while still reducing the abuse of animals, and that means that op is more likely to lose. Second principle is that animals are inferior beings to humans. We can use them however we please. So if you want to run this principle, you need to provide examples. I think things like livestock is a very good example. So where has this principle been applied before? It's about like keeping of pets, testing of vaccines and cosmetics on animals, slaughtering animals for meats. You can talk about the condition that livestock is kept in status quo, in like they're very cooped up. For example, you stuff hormones inside the chickens to make them grow bigger. It's probably not very comfortable for the chickens either, but we do so in status quo because we want meat. Or the third principle, the zoos provide entertainment for children. The state is obligated to practice. Just ask yourself why this is a good thing. I think it is possible to defend. If you feel like having some fun and you want to confuse government, you can always run this principle. I guarantee they won't expect it. So where have we done this before? Children's cartoons, etc. It's all allowed in status quo because states recognize that children need to be entertained. If not, they will drive their parents crazy. Yeah, I'm saying it's possible to run this principle. I'm not saying you should, but yeah, you make your own decisions. Okay, so developing the principles. So assume the best case of Gov, where they fully develop the principle of explaining why the treatment of animals in zoos, like as it exists right now, is morally wrong. So the first thing you can ask yourself is, can you reduce those things in opposition? And if you can, do mechanisms exist in the status quo that prevent those things to some extent? So you can talk about things like laws against the mistreatment of animals, so you can find zoos that are particularly abusive for animals. You can also look at the incentive structures of those zoos themselves, because they are profit-seeking organizations, they depend a lot on public perception. So zoos probably don't want to be seen as animal abusers most of the time, or at least they have an incentive to keep those things hidden, which just means that the likelihood of them engaging in abuse is just reduced somewhat. But lastly, just to say that the outcome of the abuse of animals that government claims is not as bad as they claim. So you mitigate those harms to a large extent to show why, even if animals are used for entertainment in the world of op, they are not mistreated horribly, which means that in some instances, it's probably still acceptable. The second thing, to directly contend the principle. So as you can see, we are doing a combination of two things. The first, to mitigate the principle, or mitigate the extent of God's principle. The second, to directly challenge it. Do we really need to give animals a life of luxury? Given that there are inherent differences between humans and animals, in principle, probably humans have some ability or have some power to, utilize animals for our own benefit. And we do so in status quo in the form of testing vaccines, drugs, and cosmetics of animals, because they are the next best alternative to test them on. So if you want to recognize animals as equal to humans, this just means that when it comes to testing drugs or like new and experimental drugs, instead of testing them on animals, you then have to test them on humans. And that's just worse, because you are subjecting a person to suffering, a person that is rational and has moral calculus. The alternative is subjecting an animal to suffering, which is on comparative better, just because the animal is doesn't have the rationality to appreciate those things, right? They don't have rights, basically. Lastly, then, animals provide meat. Meat very important, because it gives you protein. There are vegetarian alternatives, but it's easier to get protein from meat, and it's just delicious. So why would you not want to eat meat, right? So that's how you contest the principle in this regard. The next thing then, to develop a counter principle. Protecting an endangered species is really important. Now, note that this sort of ties into the question that I think it was Raymond, asked at the very start of this workshop, when it comes to comparing the principle, how do you win that comparison? So the first thing that you need to do is that you need to explain the importance of your principle, or the importance or the value that the value of the case that you're defending on your side, basically. So how do you argue that the principle of protecting endangered species is quite important? You can look at the fact that some animals are endangered, the numbers are threatened due to things like climate change, poaching like turtle eggs, pangolin, seals, etc., the loss of the natural habitat due to human deforestation, chopping down the forest, illegal logging, or things like that. You can say that the loss of biodiversity means that the ecosystem is less balanced. So zoos serve an important counterbalance by protecting endangered species, and also by preventing or population control, basically. So you can breed animals and release them back into the wild if the numbers are too low. You can also capture animals and take them out of the wild if the numbers are too high. Sort of balancing of the ecosystem, basically. Last thing you can just say is that the loss of experience of future generations, like people will never be able to see their dodo bird, they'll never be able to see the rhinoceros if those things die out. The point here isn't that seeing a rhinoceros is very good for you, because obviously you can see it in textbook. The point here is that it's an experience that the future generations are losing out on, and in principle, the current generation should prioritize, or to some extent protect, the experiences of the future generation, because these things lead to their quality of life. It's like the same reason why we should not support pollution, because pollution reduces the quality of life and reduces the quality of the experience of future generations. Like, that's the sort of comparison you want to make here. Then after that is sort of mechanizing your case to explain why your side of the house best protect animals. So zoos has a mechanism of protection. The first thing to point out is to directly flip the profit incentive on government. So Gov says that the profit incentive means that zoos engage in bad behavior. You can flip it by directly saying that the profit incentive means that you get the best kinds of protection. So it means that you keep some kind of exotic animals for people to see. This means that exotic animals are protected because they're kept in zoos. It also means there's more money to spend on helping animals, paying for their upkeep, their medical care, etc. Also, the capacity to donate to green NGOs like the World Wildlife Fund, WWF, because zoos have more money, and because generally zoos are quite environmentally friendly. Like, the reason that they're keeping animals is to preserve them to some extent. We talk about the fact that zoos provide medical care, 24-hour security, breeding aid, etc. These are all means through which you can protect endangered species. It's a smaller enclosed environment, so it's easy to monitor. But lastly, because it raises public awareness, so people who visit zoos are educated on the plight of animals and what they can do about it, which raises social awareness about the problems that animals are facing, the corporations that are engaging in illegal logging and deforestation in places like Brazil, and what they can do about it. So lobbying states, donating money towards charities. These things can only happen when people go to zoos and look at the animals and feel sad for them. It's the sympathy that drives change in this regard. The conclusion then is that zoos are the best means to protect animals, especially the endangered species. Hence, you need to keep zoos around. So after you impact, or you mechanize an impact case, or you impact and mechanize, like whichever order you prefer, then it becomes a comparison to principles. So given that opposition must accept to some extent that zoos probably will still utilize or instrumentalize animals for entertainment, is the protection of endangered species something more important than the prevention of harm towards animals? That's the comparison that you need to make. Similarly, in government, you need to explain why, in principle, the reduction of harms is one that is more important than the protection of endangered species for any number of reasons or weighing that you can do in this round. So I think that more or less wraps things up for this workshop. If anyone have any questions about the op case or about case prep in general, now would be a great time to ask. If not, I think we can break up into smaller activities, smaller groups for some practice activities. Any questions? Going 3, 2, 1. All right, gone.